Aloha and welcome to Ehana Kako, a weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I'm Keli'i Akina, president of the Grassroots Institute. I want to welcome you today and ask you to think with me a little bit about freedom. It's often something that we don't pause and consider very deeply because our lives are so very busy, and we do enjoy a certain measure of freedom here in the United States. But whether we're in the United States, in any of the particular states or elsewhere in the world, there is a question as to whether we have the maximal freedom, the freedom that we deserve, the freedom that is guaranteed by the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. Putting that aside, however, there's another question altogether related to freedom. Do we have economic freedom? And that's what I want to talk today about with my guest, Michael LaFaive, who is Director of Fiscal Policy at the prestigious Mackinac Institute in Michigan. He has spent a lifetime studying economic freedom. He's an economist himself, but more than crunching numbers, he's thought about the quality of life and how it is impacted by economic realities. And so please welcome with me for today's discussion, Michael LaFaive. Michael, aloha. Welcome to our program here in Hawaii.
Thanks for having me.
How's your weather up there in Mackinac, Michigan?
72 and perfect, though no ocean breezes.
Well, that's terrific. I'm glad that you're not freezing, and I'm glad your summer's not too swelteringly hot. Mike, you're an economist. How did you get interested in the whole question of measuring economic freedom?
Well, actually, I literally grew up thinking that there were two sets of ideas in the world. There were democratic ideas and there were Republican ideas. And then when I was 19 years old, I stumbled across a book in the Santa Monica Library in Southern California called Free to Choose. It was a book by Milton Friedman and his wife, and it changed my life forever. I realized that there were a set of ideas outside the ones that the known political parties, the big ones, were talking about, and these ideas spoke to me personally.
Well, that's very interesting because when I was an undergrad at Northwestern University studying economics, we had this big textbook by Paul Samuelson.
Oh.
And according to the textbook, there were two worlds. There was the world of macroeconomics as practiced in the United States, and there was communism. Then there was this insert of one page with a black and white photo of Milton Friedman.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me, though you'll probably think it's funny. You'll probably remember that one of Paul Samuelson's latest texts said that the Soviet economy was doing very well, very robust. And that was just a couple years before the economy collapsed in on itself and Gorbachev dissolved the Soviet Union.
That's right. And so your point is well taken that very often we think in terms of Republican versus Democrat, or even more broadly in terms of capitalism versus communism. But you're making a finer distinction here. You're saying that there's a gradient in between, and that's Milton Friedman and his ideas. And I think you've read some others as well.
I have indeed. In fact, I would argue that the ideas of economic liberty are more or less transcendent. At least ideas in general are. Victor Hugo once said that ideas are more powerful than all the armies of the world. I think that's why Milton Friedman, who advanced the ideas of economic liberty so eloquently, whether he was speaking to eggheads or the everyman, was so important to the 20th century's debate on how public policies should be decided.
Well, you know, on my crib notes and how to understand Milton Friedman, I jotted down once the acronym TANSTAFL. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. And so in a lot of ways, Milton Friedman heralded the fact that everything costs something, and that we get into a lot of trouble in government planning when we don't keep that in mind.
In fact, one of the most basic presuppositions of the economic science is that everything has a cost, even if it's just an opportunity cost. So when we go down a particular policy path, we have to ask ourselves, what better policy might we be giving up to obtain it?
Now, when we talk about economic freedom, what exactly do we mean? There's a lot of misconceptions. Sometimes people think an extreme free market is what's meant by that, in which we have the Gordon Geckos of the world without any regulation or any government trying to reel them in. But really, there's something much different that is meant by the concept of economic freedom.
Well, absolutely. In fact, the blunt single-sentence explanation for economic liberty is the ability of members or institutions represented by individuals to take some economic action. but I like a longer explanation. It is the ability of individuals to produce, to sell, to trade, to consume, or to give away assets or resources, so long as they're not engaging in the use of force or fraud or theft. Now, interference in these peaceful exchanges between consenting adults, interference in these activities by government would be considered a limitation on that economic liberty, and one that may harm an individual, a business, a state, or a nation, or even the world on net balance.
Well, you know, Michael, today we are in the United States so accustomed to the pervasive presence of government in everything that we do. You talk about government interference with the free exchange that produces the liberty of economics. In what ways does the government interfere with that free market exchange between individuals and companies?
Well, around the world, from the small items to the grand items, occupational licensure, for instance. There was a proposal in Michigan not long ago to license home decorators. Apparently, the government had some fear that somebody might set up shop and be a home decorator without their permission and guidance. So, in order to avoid that ugly pillow not matching the throw rug, the government wanted to step in and impose a licensing regime on people who enjoyed decorating and wanted to make a living at it. Thank heavens that was beaten back by good-thinking lawmakers in Lansing. But in other states, it's passed. There are, in fact, I think you may have heard this just last week yourself, mandates for beauticians that equal those of licensed pilots, commercial pilots, who fly individuals from point A to point B. Why in the world a barber or a beautician needs 1,500 hours of training before he gets permission from his state masters to engage in a trade with another adult in exchange for money is beyond me.
Well, let me play devil's advocate for a moment,
Sure.
Michael. And let's take that example of the beautician or the hair cutter. How do I protect myself from somebody who may just come at me maniacally with rusty scissors and not only give me a bad haircut, but to do some form of surgery that I'm not interested in doing? Don't I need Big Brother, the government, to set up an extensive licensing regime and a taxation procedure and a supervisory system to protect me from that evil?
Well, actually, I was going to ask you, what is to protect you from that licensed maniac who might give you a procedure you don't want? And how did our ancestors for millennia get their haircut or beauty needs taken care of long before there were ever governments? The fact of the matter is the market has provided safe and clean services such as this to individuals safely over time before the government ever got into the business of trying to regulate it. Also, there are market safety mechanisms that can be put in place to assure that you get that good haircut, that safe haircut, and that is through associations. It is very difficult to become a certified public accountant, but it is an entirely private exercise.
Now, when we talk about some of the examples that you've just used, it could seem that economic freedom is somewhat subjective, but you actually work on a project that quantifies economic freedom based upon an index, in fact, a tradition of indexes that have actually looked at variables that determine when we have economic freedom and when we don't. Do you want to talk a little bit about the project, Economic Freedom in North America?
I'd be delighted to. Years ago, economists knew that economies grew and then they shrank. We knew we had economic growth. We knew we had national output or state output. And years ago, economists said, well, look, we know it exists. Let's try to measure it. So with the best tools they had, they created the gross national product accounting and a gross domestic product accounting. And that's what economists wanted to do when they sat down in the 1980s and said, we know that some states are economically more free than others. Why don't we try to establish an objective set of measurements?
Well, Michael, I'm sorry to cut you off there for a moment, sure, but I just want to interject a point. We often hear in Hawaii that comparisons to states like Texas are not fair because whenever we use Texas as a model of good fiscal policy or prosperity in comparison to Hawaii's finances, we are told, well, that's because they've got all this oil over there in Texas and all this gas in Texas, and so no wonder they're rich and wealthy and prosperous. But what you're suggesting is that there are other variables actually responsible for economic freedom and prosperity.
That's absolutely true. Hong Kong had no oil, but in the past 2 generations, they've gone from being desperately poor to not only the #1 economically free nation in the world, but one that had galloping incomes. In fact, they worked their way up to being the #2 wealthiest nation on earth behind the United States in per capita terms. And that is while absorbing millions and millions of immigrants, the majority of which did not have high training in engineering or the sciences. They were, in fact, low-income individuals looking for an opportunity.
So it's not an issue of the level of natural resources that are available in a certain geographic area. There are other factors that you track to determine whether economic freedom and prosperity ensue.
That's exactly correct. As institutions go, we look to things like the rule of law, private property rights, and freedom to contract. But in the Economic Freedom Index of North America, there are 3 major areas where we examine, and each have subsets that we look at within that area. For instance, size of government, what we call takings and discriminatory taxation, and labor market freedom. Within the size of government, we measure consumption as a percentage of government spending. The idea being the larger government grows by engaging in expenditures, what we call consumption expenditures, the less room the private sector has to operate because they confiscate money and spend it in ways the government deems the most worthy. There's, in that index, in that area, there are transfers and subsidies, welfare payments, for instance. In my own research involving interstate migration, I have actually found a link between what Michigan transfers from higher income people to lower income people in the form of welfare and positive inbound migration. In other words, our welfare system attracts people into the state. Unfortunately, our tax system and our past labor system repelled more people than were attracted by our welfare benefits.
In other words, you have coming into the state people who are going to be taking from the government, which is really taking from other citizens, but you're actually discouraging those who would be producing and bringing wealth into the state because of tax policy.
That's correct. During the last 10 years, or really the aughts, the year of the aughts, from 2000 through 2009, we had policies the reverse of what we should have. We had a policy to import low-income people who were looking for transfer payments and export younger, more highly productive, probably college-educated people because there was less economic opportunity, less opportunity for them to find jobs here in the state of Michigan.
Well, that first factor then of the 3 that you've mentioned that you measure has to do with what percentage of the productivity or is consumed by government itself. Now, here in the state of Hawaii, we know that the largest area for our budget happens to be those transfer payments from people who pay taxes to people who receive entitlements. And it's the largest segment of our state budget, which is followed by the other services that government provides and so forth, particularly labor in the form of contracts and pay to government unions and so forth, or union personnel. So transfer payments and the cost of labor are very high, and you're suggesting that where they're high, there's an impact upon the private sector, a negative one, that we don't have business performing at the level that it could?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And in fact, economists would call it the crowding out effect. Government is crowding out private initiative by gobbling up a large percentage of revenues from the people of Hawaii and engaging in consumer expenditures, often in areas that are more expensive than necessary or not necessary at all.
There's a measure that the Economic Freedom of North America looks at called the right to work. And there are some states where that is considered fairly high because there are very few barriers to being able to work in companies that get state contracts. But in Hawaii, there are a lot of barriers because a good number of those contracts are only for people who belong to the public sector unions.
And in fact, we actually, the variable in the Economic Freedom Index of North America is specific to union density, the percentage of the working population that are dues-paying members of unions. In states that have right-to-work laws, there's typically, but not always, a smaller percentage relative to the rest of the nation, and therefore they score higher in the Economic Freedom Index. Now, no one at the Fraser Institute who has compiled this index would say that the individuals don't have a right to form a union or to participate in the union. All they're saying is that it should be a voluntary choice in order to have a job, not a mandated one. And in states like Hawaii, I assume you do not have a right to work law. It's mandated. If you want to work in a union, in a business where there's a union, you have to pay dues to the union.
Well, before we take a break in about a couple of minutes, I want to back up. You've mentioned three areas in which we measure economic freedom, the first of which has to do with the cost of government itself. But let me ask this question before the break, and you can respond to it briefly. So what? In other words, so what if government is costly? I think that here in Hawaii, many people consider that the government gives such benefits, whether it is welfare, whether it is forms of security, job insurance, pensions, and so forth, that they don't care that the government consumes such a high percentage of the productivity and income. So that's the question I'll throw at you. So what?
Well, first of all, there is an old study by a Professor Tebow, an economist, who came up with what is now known as the Tebow hypothesis. In a country like the United States, there can be regions, subnational units of government, a state or even cities and counties, where the government says, look, if you want to live here, we're going to tax you very high and we will provide very generous benefits. And people can gravitate or vote with their feet to those areas, whether it's Hawaii as a state or Texas as a state, whether it's Detroit as a city or Honolulu as a city. But I would argue that very often those costly programs are displacing private sector initiative that could provide the same benefits but much more efficiently.
And
Second of all, well, one more point, you could actually have a city like Detroit, which taxes very highly and regulates very highly, but in turn provides exceedingly poor, if not shameful, levels of services.
Well, when we return from the break, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the consequences of the lack of economic freedom. My guest today is Michael LaFaive, an economist at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy in Michigan, who works on the study of economic freedom in North America. I'm Keli'i Akina with ThinkTech Hawaii's E Hana Kākou program. We'll be right back after this short break. Don't go.
Hi, Jane.
Hi, Keith.
My name's Keith Bettinger.
I knew that.
And I'm the host of ThinkTech Asia.
I knew that too.
Here on ThinkTech.
Fabulous. You got a great show going, Keith.
Thank you very much. And for our viewers out there that are interested in ThinkTech Asia, it airs every Tuesday from 4 to 4:45, and it can be accessed online at thinktech.com.
Yeah, so what kind of guests you like?
Well, we have a number of guests from academia, from practitioners of international affairs. Sometimes we have military officials. Sometimes we have public officials on the show. And our goal, we try to talk about current issues in South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Central Asia, all throughout the Asian realm in more depth than you would find in traditional mainstream
That's the
media.
difference, isn't it?
Exactly.
That you're reaching out beyond what ordinary news media would do.
Right.
And that's why we like you so much.
We're trying to provide a thinking person's perspective, an intelligent perspective on what's going on, and we're both sides of the story, or even when there's more than two sides, we try to cover every angle. And I think that that's one of the big benefits that we provide here at ThinkTech, is it's a really innovative source of educational programming for the people of Hawaii.
You're great, Keith. You are a great host. You got a great show going on. I watch it every week.
Thanks very much.
Why don't you guys watch it every week too, okay?
4:45 to 4 to 4:45 every Tuesday.
Actually, we'll be right back. And welcome back to E Hana Kākou. We're here every week on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I want to encourage you to go to the thinktechhawaii.com website because there's a wealth of programming there. The studio, under the direction of Jay Fidel, with a tremendous team, produces about 30 hours of program every week with live streaming all around the clock. And so you can watch your favorite ThinkTech Hawaii programs anytime you want to. My guest today is Michael LaFaive. He is an economist at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. He's the director of fiscal policy. And he is analyzing all across the nation and throughout North America the factors that contribute to economic freedom. In fact, he's mentioned that there are three major categories. One, the size of government as a percentage of the economy, and we've talked a bit about that. But there are another couple of other categories that Michael looks at. Michael, why don't we just pick up with that? What's the second category that we examine?
The second major area involves what's called takings and discriminatory taxation. In order for Hawaii to consume and to engage in consumption expenditures, it must first take, and that's where our taxation levels come in. The Economic Freedom Index of North America measures total tax revenue as a percent of gross domestic product. It also measures top marginal tax rates of every state. And since we're talking about North America, also the provinces of Canada and the states of Mexico. There's a couple of other subcomponents, but those are the two major ones. Here in Michigan, we have a flat rate, fortunately, of just 4.25%, so we actually do well in that category. But many other states do not do well because they have a multi-tiered income tax system with a very high personal income tax rates.
And so where you see, I would imagine, in the report, high levels of taxation, you also see certain consequences that impact economic freedom. What are some of those consequences?
And in fact, those consequences are one of the reasons that the tax variable is in virtually every index of economic freedom that there is. Because what we have found and what scholars have cataloged over decades is that the more you confiscate from individuals, the less willing they are to put in that marginal hour of work to earn that marginal dollar of income. And that's very important.
In other words, taxation is ultimately counterproductive in many cases, counterproductive to economic productivity, because it can discourage people from working more, thereby discouraging them from producing more and ultimately reducing the revenues that government would collect in the end anyway.
There is a point at which the taxation levels in exchange for the services the government are providing become more harmful than good. And that level, the higher level, the level of confiscation, the worse economies and states and individuals do, and by a number of different metrics, and I'll get into those in just a moment.
Well,
the third,
an example, and sorry, our long distance connection between Hawaii and Michigan cut us off there for a second, but we have a situation here in our legislature where projects are proposed as bills accompanied by the power with which to tax people to pay for them, but never is there a presentation of what the consequences of that taxation would be. One, for example, is the frequent recourse to the general excise and sales tax in Hawaii, just upping it a half a percentage point or whatever, that ends up impacting the income that the middle class, the lower middle class, and the poor actually have to spend, because they spend most of their money at places where they have to pay general excise and sales tax. Is that the kind of consequence you're talking about?
Well, that's exactly the kind of consequence. It hurts the very people that could be far more productive and invent far more useful products and services that others would enjoy consuming if only they had the few extra dollars necessary to do so.
So how do you account for this, that legislators would say, this is what we're going to do to raise the money through taxation, but don't present the other side of the ledger, what the cost will be and what its long-term impact will be upon the productivity of the economy?
Well, it's very easy to explain. These are political decisions, not sound economic ones. It's very difficult to herd cats, and that's exactly what taxpayers are. However, the benefits derived by a narrow group of individuals from that tax hike are extremely concentrated, and it's very easy to herd those special interests in order to get the votes that are necessary. All too often, the politicians realize that the benefits to them of doing that are concentrated with them and those direct beneficiaries, but the costs are very diffused and hard to track. So it makes holding those politicians accountable very, very difficult.
Now, your third area that you examine has to do with labor.
Labor market freedom. We have a number of sub-indexes under that, including minimum wage legislation, government employment as a percentage of state employment, and the union density I've already mentioned. With regard to minimum wage legislation, the creators of this index decided that minimum wage is a very unnecessary interference between the government and an individual and business that wants to voluntarily and peacefully exchange labor for money. And here at the Mackinac Center, again, related to that migration study, we found a link between the willingness of our state to pay higher than federally mandated minimum wages and an outflow of Michigan citizens, probably because we have less opportunity than states like Texas, where they had a lower one, or better overall economic well-being. As a government employment as a percentage of state employment is very similar to the crowding out effect that government consumption expenditures create. The more people you hire for the state of Hawaii to work on particular projects, the more money you need to pay them, and hence the greater degree that private sector initiatives are crowded out in the labor market.
Well, you know, I'd love to interact with you on both of those areas. First, minimum wage.
Sure.
Because I think people can relate a lot to the minimum wage law and freedom itself. Here in Hawaii, we have a growing homelessness problem. And sad to say, we have sprawling tent cities of homeless people on all of our islands. In one part of our main island, Oahu, the southern part of Honolulu called Kaka'ako, it's incredible the amount of tents that are there. Now, recent estimates say that perhaps 70% or more of them happen to be Micronesians who've been displaced and cannot get work. Well, I've talked to some of these people, and if they could work for $5 an hour or work without the minimum wage, they would gladly do that. And there are people who would hire them for short terms such as that. Is this a direct impact upon the freedom of both the individual to work and somebody willing to hire them through the minimum wage?
Absolutely, by definition. In fact, the only true minimum wage is zero, which is what Micronesians and others will make every time the minimum wage is ratcheted up, because you're asking employers to engage in charity beyond a certain amount. If I was 14 years old and brought zero talent to your business and said I would like a job, but the government mandated wages for a talent of $7.50 an hour, then the business is having to basically engage in an act of charity. And many won't. In fact, that's one of the reasons you see businesses coming up with novel ideas for people to serve themselves, particularly at restaurants in this particular example. They must displace employees, either don't hire new ones or let existing ones go. And in exchange for that, individuals fill their own pop cups and even order their own food.
Michael, what does the research show in terms of the impact of higher minimum wage laws on the cost of business, on the ability of businesses to employ and or even to afford the level of employees that they would like to have?
I don't have those particular numbers at my disposal, but they're very significant. And what's even more, I guess you could say, offensive is that the low-income people who are managing to get these minimum wage jobs are often teenagers looking to pick up a little pocket money who also happen to have wealthier parents and live in the suburbs. The ones that are being hurt the most are the ones who most desperately need to reach the first rung on that economic ladder.
Now, the second illustration you used was the percentage of employees in the overall employment market that are employed by government in a certain state. In Hawaii, we have a very high percentage of government employees compared to the general population. What is the negative impact of that upon the economy and upon economic freedom?
Well, certainly the extraordinary cost of employing government workers, at least prior to the Great Recession, the growth was quite extraordinary. In fact, here in Michigan, we estimated that if you just gave all government employees at the state and local levels the same benefits package on average that is received by private sector workers, we could save $5.7 billion a year in costs at the state and local government for employing these government employees. We're not asking to cut any programs. We're not asking to cut the salary of government workers. We're just asking the state to normalize the benefit packages paid to government workers. They're very expensive on balance, and they we require higher levels of taxation to pay for jobs that might very well be performed by private sector or government people with a less generous benefits package.
Very good. Well, Michael, thank you very much. When we come back from a break, I'm going to ask you where Hawaii ranks amongst the 50 states in terms of its level of economic freedom. Don't go away. This is Keli'i Akina speaking with Michael LaFaive, an economist, talking about economic freedom in North America. You're watching the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. We'll be right back.
This is Alex Lee Hagan, host of ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. My show here at ThinkTech Hawaii is every Thursday from 3 to 4 in the afternoon. I bring in interesting guests from Hawaii, the mainland, and hopefully international guests in the future. Do join us on Thursday from 3 to 4 p.m. ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. Aloha.
Aloha, my name is Paul Jackson, better known as PJ, and my local interest is in sports. I have my own sports radio show at KWAI AM 1080 that you can stream live. I also have my own website, pjsportsradio.com. We have live guests in studio, and we talk about discussions and topics that everyone wants to know locally here on the islands. We cover everything from surfing to basketball to whatever's going on locally, sports-wise. We try to do our best and cover the topics in depth as much as we can. Once again, thank you for joining PJ here on Hawaii Sports Update. Mahalo.
Welcome back to Ehana Kako. We're here every week on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. Ehana Kako is based on a Hawaiian phrase, e pule kako, which means let's pray together. At the Grassroots Institute, we like to say, let's work together. Let's unite Hawaii's people to work together for a better government, economy, and society. And part of that work is doing the research by taking a look at what's happening across the world. Frequently, when we're simply stuck in our own cocoon here in the state of Hawaii, we are forced to solve problems without looking outside of Hawaii to see how best practices are developing across the nation or across the world. One of the best practices in managing a state's economy is to take a look at research across the board and to identify those variables that lead to economic freedom and economic prosperity and use those measures for implementing them that work elsewhere. And that's part of the project of think tanks like the Mackinac Center for Public Policy and the Grassroots Institute of Hawaii. We're related through a national network of think tanks called the State Policy Network. My guest today, Michael LaFaive, is an economist at the Mackinac Center in Michigan. And I'm just going to pick up where we left off, talking a little bit about economic freedom and applying what you have to say to Hawaii. Michael, tell me a bit about some of the states and their rankings in the Economic Freedom of North America report, particularly Hawaii. But before I go on, I do want to give some credit here. The EFNA, E-F-N-A, Economic Freedom of North America, is published annually by the Fraser Institute in Toronto, a Canadian think tank. And so I don't think they're Republican or Democrat up there. They're just observing the data and disseminating it, and we're learning a lot from them. Thanks to the folks at Fraser who make this possible. So, Michael, where's Hawaii stand in comparison to other states?
Well, amongst the 50 states in the United States, Hawaii ranks 42nd.
42nd? You mean toward the bottom?
That's correct. You did better than Maine. Congratulations. But not better than Michigan, which was ranked 39th. Michigan has improved in recent years, and I believe actually Hawaii has improved from 2005 when they first started this particular index. Of course, it's the Economic Freedom Index of North America. So they also included Canadian and Mexican states, and some of the results were very interesting. A number of Canadian provinces outperform most of the United States. In fact, you have to rank Texas up there as number 4th on the all-country index with Canada, United States, and Mexico. They're behind Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland. So Texas, however, is number one if you just look at the United States, and that's no surprise. They've been number one in a variety of different indexes, whether they're produced by the American Legislative Exchange Council or other indexes like the Competitiveness Index produced by the old Beacon Hill Institute. They're not old, they still exist, but it's an older study. And Texas is followed by South Dakota and North Dakota as leaders in economic liberty. And that too is really not too much of a surprise to me, given their policies.
Now, the measure of economic freedom also correlates to some other trends that we see, including migration from states that are low on economic freedom scale to states that are high, such as Texas. Are you observing that?
Yes, in fact, it's not the only index that have linked where you end up in the economic freedom index with your migration rates. In fact, one of the great untold stories, I think, of American migration in the latter half of the 20th century is the migration of people from states with low economic freedom to states with high economic freedom. You could just as easily say states with lower economic opportunities to states with higher economic opportunities. You could just pull out one variable in the United States and say right to work, and it would highly correlate, because the greater labor freedom there is, the greater opportunity there is for people to find jobs.
Yes, and the kind of migration that you're talking about is the migration of people who contribute productively to the economy. So their loss from a state is actually an economic loss, and it's a gain for the state that gains these people.
That's right, and typically even many of these migration studies will actually control for other things that make people migrate, like days of sunshine, for instance, which would be important to states like Hawaii or Texas or Florida. And economists will control for days of sunshine, temperature, precipitation, and that sort of thing to make sure their model isn't picking up migration dedicated to weather and not to economic opportunity.
Well, that also helps to explain something we know anecdotally in Hawaii, and that is the brain drain. My 4 siblings are all on the mainland USA because of economic opportunity. Patty and I have 4 children, 3 of whom are grown, and those 3 are on the mainland as well for the same thing. And they say, Dad, maybe we'll come back when we can afford a mortgage in Hawaii. And so we know these things from an anecdotal or story basis, but it's so good and heartening to hear that we can actually begin quantifying the variables that are involved and that influence this kind of migration, because that means maybe we can do something about it. Is there a relationship between being able to research this and then being able to come up with good policy?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, at the Mackinac Center, we have repeatedly pointed to the sound public policies that are in the Economic Freedom Index and other top indexes and recommended these policies with that reasoning, and we've won out. In fact, Michigan was not a right-to-work state just a few years ago. Today it is. I think you can attribute some of that to our pointing to the fact that people migrate to right-to-work states. You can look at corporate tax reform, same thing. So we've pounded these messages home, and we've repeatedly cited these important indexes. I should mention that the correlations aren't just associated with higher living standards and economic growth. They certainly are. But there's something like 100 different academic studies published today in peer-reviewed journals that have found links between the Economic Freedom Index of North America's output and such things as income equality. There's greater income equality in nations that score high in the World Index, less corruption in countries that score high in the World Index, less political violence. Believe it or not, there's actually higher reports of happiness in countries that are more free as opposed to less free. Now, I have been pointing basically to the index that covers the globe, but those same ideas can be translated into state-level research, and that's what we've done here at the Mackinac Center.
Now, what you say is quite fascinating and telling, but it is counterintuitive because people often correlate economic equality or parity of economic status with programs that the government brings about, with a social obligation that we all have. But what you're pointing out is by using the objective measures of economic freedom indexes, particularly the economic freedom of the world or economic freedom of North America, we see that where there is greater economic freedom on the statistical level, you actually have these goodies such as social justice, you have less of a gap between the rich and the poor. You even have, and I won't ask you how you measure it, a measure of greater happiness.
And you could add lifespan to that. You can add greater investment in physical and human capital, and globally, less wars. So show me a metric that you and I want to champion for the world and its well-being, and I think we can find a positive correlation between where they sit in the Economic Freedom Index and what's going on in that country.
So why is there so little discourse about economic liberty or economic freedom? Why is it that the discussion in the economy when it comes to meeting the needs of the most needy always tends toward greater investment in social welfare and more government solutions?
You know, Thomas Jefferson once said it's something like the natural order of things is for government to grow and liberty to recede. And I think he captured what we call a public choice economic sentiment, where people have an economic incentive to see particular programs grow, and it results in there being very concentrated benefits with diffuse costs. And as long as those costs are diffused, you and I are so busy raising our family, paying bills, running a business, that we don't have enough time to keep an eye on the political class and what they're taking from us to do to us. And unfortunately, though, there are think tanks like the Grassroots Institute and the Mackinac Center that get paid to keep an eye on the political class and try to keep them in check with support for better policies and support for constitutional restraints on the ability of government to grow and take more from us to do more to us.
Just a bit of review here. The Economic Freedom of North America Index is compiled annually. Actually, it's worked on all throughout the year, but it's published annually. And the next version is going to come out sometime this fall. Do you know what month that'll be?
Well, they're shooting for September, but I wouldn't hold it against them if it was October or November, because they rely on a number of government sources for their data. And if that isn't released, they can't move forward.
And how many variables altogether are actually tracked by the model that is used in the EFNA, Economic Freedom of North America?
There are three major areas, and I would count about 6 to 10 subgroups, depending on how you measure the index.
Well, that's certainly a lot of research there, and I know there's a lot of detailed data that goes into the project. Ultimately, in the end, do you see that economic freedom is an issue that those who promote capitalism, so to speak, or those who promote free markets are most excited about and have much to benefit from? Or is economic freedom something that everybody across the board, including the poor and especially the poor, benefit from?
Well, especially the poor. They have the farthest to go in terms of their economic position in the world today. But the great news is wealth is extremely dynamic, especially in market economies, more like the United States or even Hong Kong, which is more market friendly than the United States. And in those countries, in our country, you can see that people can climb out of the bottom 5 to 20% throughout their lifetime, and we can make it easier for them by removing barriers to free exchange between consenting adults. That's what economic freedom is about. I'm hardly the first person to say it, but I, with your help, am trying to say it a lot louder.
Well, thank you. Michael, it's been enjoyable talking with you. Thank you for staying up a bit late tonight to talk with us here in Hawaii. I hope you'll visit us soon.
I look forward to it. Aloha.
Aloha to you. My guest today, Michael LaFaive, has been an economist at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. And you can take a look at more research that is done with the Economic Freedom of North America, of which the Grassroots Institute here in Hawaii is a partner with the Fraser Institute. Just go to our website, grassrootsinstitute.org. That's grassrootsinstitute.org. And until next week, I wish you a wonderful aloha from ThinkTech Hawaii's Ehana Kako. Aloha.